On the day my husband died, I stayed silent about the $20 million inheritance and about the young woman sitting alone in the back row of the funeral home. No one else seemed to notice her. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even the relatives whispering near the flower arrangements about Frank's estate and the future of the family company. But I noticed her the moment she walked in. She had Frank's eyes, the same tired blue eyes that always looked softer when he was carrying guilt. I said nothing. I simply folded my hands in my lap and stared ahead while my husband's closed casket rested beneath soft white lilies at the front of the room. After 38 years of marriage, you learn when silence matters more than questions. And that morning, silence was the only thing holding my family together. For the moment. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes I still can't believe how far one family's pain can travel. The funeral home smelled faintly of roses and coffee. Outside, November rain pressed against the windows in long gray streaks, turning the parking lot into blurred reflections of headlights and umbrellas. My son David stood near the entrance greeting people with the exhausted politeness grief demands from men who spent their entire lives trying to appear strong. At 42, David had become the kind of man strangers respected immediately. Expensive suits, calm voice, confident handshake. The successful CEO everyone in Cedar Falls seemed proud to claim as their own. But grief had stripped something from him that morning. He looked smaller somehow, more like the little boy who used to crawl into our bed after thunderstorms. Beside him stood his wife Victoria in a black wool dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She held his arm gently while speaking in soft, controlled whispers to guests arriving through the double doors. Perfect posture, perfect makeup, perfect sympathy. Victoria always understood appearances. That was one of the reasons people trusted her so easily. I watched her hand expensive tissues to distant cousins she barely knew while funeral music drifted quietly through the room. Then her eyes landed briefly on me. "Are you all right, Margaret?" she asked softly. Margaret, not Mom. Not even after 15 years of marriage. I nodded politely. "I'm fine." That was the lie older women learn to tell automatically. Fine usually means, "I'm lonely. I'm tired. I haven't slept properly in weeks. I don't want to become a burden in front of everyone." But nobody likes complicated answers at funerals. Victoria gave my shoulder a quick squeeze before turning back toward guests entering the room. And just like that, I disappeared again. It's strange how invisibility happens when you get older. Not all at once. Slowly. Phone calls become shorter. People stop asking your opinion. Family dinners continue without checking whether you're free. Then one day you realize you've become background noise inside your own life. Frank noticed it before I did. About 6 months before he died, he started asking unusual questions late at night while we sat together in the living room. "Do you think David calls enough? Do you have enough money each month? Are you happy here alone?" At the time, I thought grief over aging had simply caught up to him. Now I know he was trying to prepare me for something. I just didn't understand what. The pastor began speaking near the casket, his calm voice blending with soft rain outside. I barely heard the words. My attention kept drifting toward the young woman in the back row. She looked maybe 26. Dark hair pulled loosely behind her shoulders. Simple navy coat. No jewelry except a thin silver necklace resting against her collarbone. She hadn't spoken to anyone since arriving. But twice, I caught her staring at Frank's casket with the kind of heartbreak that doesn't belong to strangers. And each time, she quickly looked away before anyone noticed. Except me. After nearly 4 decades of marriage, I knew exactly what my husband looked like reflected in another person's face. The realization should have shattered me. Oddly enough, it didn't. Because deep down, I think part of me had known for years that Frank carried secrets he never fully explained. Little things. Business trips that lasted 1 extra day. Quiet phone calls taken outside. Moments where guilt crossed his face too quickly to question. But marriage at our age becomes complicated. Sometimes love means understanding another person's imperfections before they're ever confessed aloud. The service ended shortly after noon. People gathered slowly near the lobby exchanging casseroles, condolences, and careful gossip disguised as concern. That's how small-town funerals work. Everyone speaks softly while listening closely. I sat alone near the chapel doors watching rainwater slide down the windows when David finally approached me. "You holding up okay?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "As well as anyone can." He nodded distractedly, already glancing toward his vibrating phone. Work never really released David completely. Not even today. Before he could leave again, Victoria appeared beside him carrying 2 paper coffee cups. 1 cream, 2 sugars, she said, handing one toward me. I looked at the cup for a moment. Wrong order. After 15 years, she still didn't know how I took my coffee. David didn't notice. He accepted his own cup while reading another message on his phone. The attorney called. He muttered quietly to Victoria. He wants us there by 3. Her expression sharpened slightly. Today. He nodded once. Something moved silently between them then. Expectation, not grief. I suddenly understood they were already thinking about the estate, the trust, the company shares, the properties. And somewhere beneath all of that rested the $20 million inheritance Frank spent years quietly building. An inheritance neither of them fully understood yet. I lowered my eyes toward my coffee cup, still untouched. Margaret. Victoria's voice pulled me back. You should come home with us tonight. Home. Funny word. After Frank died, I wasn't entirely sure where home existed anymore. I'll be all right, I said gently. David finally looked up from his phone. You sure? I nodded. What I didn't say was this. For the last 3 years, I'd already been living alone emotionally. Widowhood had simply made it official. The funeral home gradually emptied until only close family remained. That was when the young woman finally approached me. Not David. Not Victoria. Me. She moved carefully across the carpet like someone afraid of interrupting something sacred. Up close, she looked even more like Frank. Same eyes. Same nervous habit of rubbing her thumb against her palm. My chest tightened unexpectedly. I'm sorry for your loss, she said softly. Her voice trembled slightly. Thank you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a sealed envelope. My name is Elena, she whispered. Frank told me to give you this if anything ever happened to him. Everything inside me went still. Not shocked, just suddenly aware that my life was about to divide itself into before and after. I accepted the envelope carefully. Her fingers shook when they brushed mine. He wanted you to know, she said quietly, tears filling her eyes, that he never stopped loving you. Before I could answer, Victoria's voice echoed sharply from across the lobby. Margaret? The car's here. Elena stepped backward immediately, panic flashing across her face. I understood instantly. No one else knew who she was. Not yet. And maybe Frank never intended them to. I slipped the envelope into my purse without another word. Elena lowered her eyes quickly and disappeared through the front doors into the rain before David even turned around. Victoria frowned slightly watching the young woman leave. Who was that? I stood slowly, gripping my purse tighter than before. No one, I answered softly. Another lie. But this one mattered. An hour later, we sat inside the attorney's office overlooking downtown Cedar Falls while rain continued falling against tall glass windows. David leaned forward impatiently at the conference table while Victoria rested one manicured hand against his arm. Across from us, attorney Richard Hale adjusted his glasses and opened a thick leather folder. Frank trusted Richard for almost 20 years. Which meant whatever happened next had already been planned carefully. Richard looked toward me first. Not David. Not Victoria. Me. Then he spoke the sentence that changed everything. Before we discuss the inheritance, he said quietly, theirs. Someone Frank legally recognized 6 years ago that the family needs to know about. Beside me, Victoria stopped breathing. David slowly frowned. And inside my purse, the sealed envelope suddenly felt heavier than $20 million. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Richard Hale mentioned the person Frank had legally recognized. The rain tapped softly against the office windows overlooking downtown Cedar Falls while the grandfather clock near the bookshelf ticked steadily in the corner. David leaned forward first. What does that mean exactly? Richard removed his glasses slowly, like a man preparing for impact. It means your father amended his trust 6 years ago. Victoria's posture changed immediately beside him. Subtle, but noticeable. People reveal themselves fastest around money. I kept both hands folded quietly in my lap while my purse rested against my knees, Elena's unopened envelope still hidden inside. My heart hadn't settled since the funeral home. Not because of the inheritance, because of the girl's eyes. Frank's eyes. Richard opened another folder carefully. Before his death, Frank established a protected family trust valued at approximately $20 million. David exhaled slowly under his breath. Even though he was successful himself, that number still landed heavily in the room. $20 million changes the temperature around people. Victoria spoke carefully. And the beneficiary? Richard looked directly at me. Margaret remains primary controller of the trust. That surprised both of them. I saw it immediately. David blinked. Victoria sat straighter. Not upset exactly. Just recalculating. Richard continued calmly. However, Frank included additional protected distributions tied to another beneficiary. There it was again. The room tightened around the sentence. David frowned. What other beneficiary? Richard hesitated briefly before answering. A young woman named Elena Navarro. Silence. Complete silence. Victoria looked confused first, then suspicious. David stared blankly across the table. I'm sorry, he said slowly. Who? I looked down at my wedding ring. 38 years. And somehow I still wasn't prepared for hearing another woman's child connected to my husband's name. Richard folded his hands together carefully. Frank legally acknowledged Elena 6 years ago through private documentation attached to the trust. Victoria inhaled sharply. Oh my God. David looked pale now. You're saying my father had another child? Richard nodded once. Yes. Nobody moved after that. Rainwater slid quietly down the windows behind him while downtown traffic crawled through the wet afternoon below. The entire city kept moving while my family quietly cracked apart around a conference table. I should have felt humiliated, angry, destroyed. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Because grief changes the order of emotions sometimes. Frank had already been gone for 6 days. The shock of losing him came first. The betrayal arrived later. David leaned back heavily in his chair. This has to be some kind of mistake. It isn't, Richard answered gently. Victoria looked toward me immediately, and I recognized the expression. Not sympathy. Assessment. She wanted to know whether I already knew. I kept my face still. At 70 years old, silence becomes its own form of survival. David rubbed both hands over his face slowly. When did Dad tell you this? He asked me quietly. I looked at him. He didn't. Technically true. Frank never spoke the words aloud. But there were moments over the years that made more sense now. Business trips to Portland. Private tuition payments he once called an old obligation. The guilt that crossed his face whenever conversations drifted toward family. Small pieces finally finding their place. Victoria spoke carefully. So this Elena woman, she paused delicately. She's entitled to part of the trust? Richard nodded. Yes. How much? David shot her a sharp look immediately. Victoria. What? She whispered defensively. We need to understand the situation. The situation. Interesting choice of words. Not. Your father had another daughter. Not. Margaret must be devastated. Just. The situation. Richard opened another document. Elena receives structured distributions through a separate protected account. He glanced down briefly. Frank specifically requested privacy surrounding her identity until after his death. David stared toward the rain-covered windows silently. My father had a daughter for 26 years. Richard corrected him gently. Elena is 27. That detail hit harder than it should have. 27 years. Which meant Frank's secret existed during most of our marriage. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the paperwork immediately. I could almost hear her calculating dates, assets, legal structures. Some people process betrayal emotionally. Others process consequences. David suddenly stood and walked toward the windows. I can't do this today. His voice cracked slightly near the end. And just like that, he sounded young again. Not CEO David Harrison. Just my son. I watched his reflection in the glass. Broad shoulders. Gray wool coat. A man trying very hard not to fall apart in front of strangers. Richard looked toward me quietly. There's more. Of course there was. There always is. I nodded once. Go ahead. Richard reached into the folder again and removed a sealed envelope. My stomach tightened instantly. Frank's handwriting covered the front. For Margaret. Simple. Familiar. Painfully familiar. Richard slid the envelope carefully across the table toward me. He instructed me to give this to you privately after the funeral. David turned immediately. You got a letter? I stared at Frank's handwriting for several seconds before answering. Yes. Victoria shifted subtly in her seat again. Curiosity mixed with anxiety now. I understood why. Letters from dead men usually contain power. Especially wealthy dead men. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside rested 3 handwritten pages folded neatly together. Frank's handwriting looked shakier than I remembered. The final year of his illness had weakened him more than he admitted. I began reading silently. Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've already left you carrying burdens you never deserved. That first sentence nearly undid me. I lowered the page briefly and inhaled slowly before continuing. I never stopped loving you. But years ago, I made choices I spent the rest of my life trying to repair quietly. Elena is innocent in all of this. Her mother died when Elena was 14. After that, I helped support her from a distance because I couldn't live with abandoning my child completely. Across the table, David sat back down slowly. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even breathed loudly. I continued reading. You once asked me why I seemed sadder as I got older. This was why. Guilt ages a man faster than time ever will. Tears blurred my vision briefly. Not dramatic tears, just quiet ones that arrive when truth finally reaches you too late to change anything. Frank's final paragraph hit hardest of all. I know our family has grown distant, especially after retirement, when you became lonely in ways I should have noticed sooner. That's why I protected the trust under your control. Not David's. Not the company's. Yours. Because you spent your whole life taking care of everyone else while slowly disappearing inside the family you built. The room went completely still around me. Even Victoria looked shaken now. I folded the letter carefully back into the envelope. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then quietly, David asked, "Mom, were you lonely?" The question hurt more than the affair. Because my son genuinely didn't know the answer already. David didn't answer my question right away. He just sat there across the attorney's conference table staring at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Outside, the rain had finally slowed to a light drizzle over downtown Cedar Falls. Cars moved slowly beneath gray skies, while people hurried along sidewalks carrying umbrellas and grocery bags. Ordinary life. Completely unaware that my family had just split open. Richard Hale quietly gathered a few papers together, giving us space without officially leaving the room. That's one thing good attorneys understand. Sometimes silence matters more than legal explanations. "Mom," David said carefully, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked down at Frank's letter resting in my lap. The paper still smelled faintly like his study. Leather books, coffee, old cedar shelves. Funny the things grief notices. What would I have said? I asked softly. That you were struggling. I almost smiled at that word. Struggling. People hear that and imagine dramatic things. Evictions, public breakdowns, desperation. But loneliness in old age usually looks much quieter. You eat dinner alone too many nights in a row. You stop buying certain groceries because cooking for one person feels pointless. You pretend the television noise counts as company. I wasn't starving, I said gently. I was just alone more than I expected. David leaned back slowly in his chair. The exhaustion on his face looked older now. He rubbed one hand across his jaw the same way Frank used to whenever stress caught up to him. I called you every week. Yes. And we visited. Sometimes. His expression tightened slightly. Because deep down he knew. Phone calls became shorter over the years. Visits became holiday obligations instead of spontaneous moments. That's how distance grows inside families. Not through cruelty. Through postponement. Victoria finally spoke from beside him. You never said anything was wrong. I looked at her calmly. Neither accusation nor defense lived in her voice yet. Just discomfort. Women my age weren't raised to complain, I answered quietly. Especially not to our children. That seemed to silence her. Because it was true. My generation learned to survive privately. You kept your marriage problems private. Your money problems private. Your loneliness private. Sometimes too private. Richard cleared his throat softly near the end of the table. There are still several trust details Frank wanted reviewed. David exhaled sharply. Can this wait until tomorrow? Richard hesitated. Certain things probably shouldn't. The room tightened again immediately. I watched Victoria straighten slightly beside David. There it was again. That alertness around money. Not greed exactly. Not yet. But attention. Richard opened another folder. Frank structured the inheritance very specifically. I folded the letter carefully back into its envelope while he spoke. The primary trust remains protected under Margaret's authority. However, several family assets, including the lake property in Oregon and portions of the investment portfolio, were set aside separately. David frowned. For Elena? Richard nodded once. In partial trust allocation, yes. Victoria blinked quickly. Partial meaning what exactly? Richard glanced down at the documents. Approximately 30%. Silence. David looked stunned. Victoria looked calculating. And me? I just felt tired. 30% sounded enormous to them. To me, it sounded like 27 years of guilt measured in dollars. David shook his head slowly. My father gave nearly a third of the inheritance to someone none of us even knew existed. Richard answered carefully. He believed it was the fairest solution available. Fair. Interesting word. Marriage teaches you fairness and love are rarely the same thing. I stared at the rain outside while memories slowly rearranged themselves in my head. Frank taking mysterious trips to Portland twice a year. The tuition checks he once claimed were business expenses. The strange sadness that settled over him every November. For years I ignored those things because long marriages survive partly through selective silence. You notice everything. You just don't always force it into daylight. Victoria crossed one leg over the other carefully. And this girl, she paused. Elena, is she planning to contest anything further? David looked at her sharply. Victoria. What? She whispered. I'm asking a reasonable question. No one answered immediately. Because it wasn't really about Elena. It was about security. Control. The future. I recognized that tone because I'd heard softer versions of it for years. During holidays. Conversations about investments. Discussions about retirement property. Victoria liked certainty. And Frank's secret had just destroyed all of it. Richard finally spoke again. Elena has no intention of disrupting the family. I thought about the girl standing quietly in the back of the funeral home. The trembling in her hands when she gave me the envelope. The careful sadness in her voice. No, she didn't strike me as someone chasing money. She looked like someone who spent most of her life standing outside a locked door. David leaned forward suddenly. Did Dad ever explain why he kept this hidden? Richard hesitated longer this time. Then quietly. He was afraid of losing all of you. That sentence settled heavily into the room. Because for the first time all afternoon, Frank sounded less like a liar and more like a frightened old man who made irreversible choices. I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered the final month before his death. Frank sitting beside the bedroom window, unable to sleep. Frank asking strange questions about forgiveness. Frank staring at family photos longer than usual. At the time, I thought he feared dying. Now I think he feared leaving behind unfinished truths. Victoria suddenly stood from her chair. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, she walked toward the office hallway in her black heels. The door clicked shut behind her. David watched after her for several seconds. Then he lowered his voice. She's worried. I know. She's not a bad person, Mom. Interesting thing to say? Not. She's shocked. Not. She feels terrible for you. Just, she's not bad. I studied my son quietly. When people feel uncertain financially, I said gently, their real character usually gets louder. His face tightened slightly. Maybe he understood what I meant. Maybe he didn't want to. Richard finally closed the folder in front of him. There's one last issue Frank wanted addressed today. I looked up slowly. What issue? The attorney removed a small brass key from the folder and placed it carefully on the table between us. Frank rented a private storage unit under the trust. David frowned. A storage unit? Richard nodded. He instructed that Margaret and Elena open it together. That caught both of us off guard. Together? David repeated. Richard slid a second envelope across the table. Frank said the contents explained everything. My stomach tightened again. Because families survive secrets until the moment truth becomes physical. Letters. Keys. Documents. Proof. Outside the office window, the clouds finally began to break apart above the city. Thin sunlight touched the wet streets for the first time all day. But sitting there beside my son with Frank's final secrets spread across a conference table between us, I had the terrible feeling the hardest part of this story hadn't even begun yet. Victoria didn't come back into Richard Hale's office for nearly 10 minutes. During that time, nobody said much. David stood near the windows staring down at traffic moving through wet downtown streets, while Richard quietly organized paperwork into neat stacks across the conference table. And I sat there holding the small brass storage key in my palm, wondering how many secrets one marriage could survive after death. The key felt older than the rest of Frank's belongings. Heavy, worn smooth around the edges. Important. David finally turned away from the window. You knew something was wrong before Dad died, didn't you? I looked up slowly. What makes you say that? He hesitated. Because you don't seem surprised enough. That was fair. Most wives probably would have screamed, cried, demanded explanations from a dead man who could no longer provide them. But grief changes your priorities. At 70 years old, dramatic reactions feel exhausting. And honestly, part of me had spent years quietly preparing for truths I never wanted confirmed. I knew your father carried guilt, I answered softly. I just didn't know its name. David lowered his eyes briefly. That answer hurt him. Not because of Frank. Because children always want to believe their parents' marriage was simpler than it really was. Richard carefully closed another folder. Frank loved Margaret very much. David gave a bitter little laugh. People don't usually hide children from people they love. The room fell quiet again. And strangely enough, I didn't rush to defend Frank. Because love and betrayal sometimes live uncomfortably close together after enough years. I remembered our final anniversary dinner 6 months earlier. Frank barely touched his steak that night. He kept watching me across the restaurant table with this strange sadness in his eyes. Finally, he asked, "If you discovered something painful about me after I was gone, do you think you'd still remember the good parts too?" At the time, I thought he was afraid of death. Now I understood he was afraid of judgment. Before I could answer David, the office door opened quietly. Victoria stepped back inside carrying a paper cup of water with both hands. Her makeup still looked perfect, but her eyes didn't. She sat beside David carefully. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I just needed a minute." David nodded once, but didn't touch her hand the way he normally would have. Small distance, but noticeable. Marriage changes in tiny moments before it changes in obvious ones. Victoria looked toward Richard. "So what exactly is in the storage unit?" Richard folded his hands together. "I don't know." That surprised all of us. Frank was methodical about everything. Investments, taxes, business records. Even his closet stayed color-organized for years. Keeping something hidden from his attorney meant it mattered deeply. "He only told me the contents were intended for Margaret and Elena specifically," Richard explained. "And he insisted they open it together." Victoria frowned slightly. "Why together?" No one answered immediately. "Because we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever waited inside probably connected them somehow." David finally sat back down at the table with a tired sigh. "When can we access it?" Richard glanced toward me. "Anytime Margaret chooses." I noticed that immediately. Not David. Not the executor. Me. Frank kept placing control back into my hands. Maybe because he understood how little control I'd quietly carried inside my own family for years. I looked down at the brass key again. "I want to meet Elena first." Victoria shifted subtly beside David. Again small, but visible. The mention of Elena unsettled her in ways she tried hard to hide. Not because of the affair itself. Because uncertainty had entered the family. And uncertainty threatens people who depend on stability. Richard nodded. "That's probably wise." David rubbed his forehead slowly. "I still can't believe this is happening." Neither could I. But sitting there in that office, I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Frank's secret daughter wasn't the only hidden thing in our family. Loneliness had been hidden too. Distance. Resentment. Years of quiet disconnection nobody addressed because appearances remained polished. Frank's affair just forced all of it into daylight. Victoria spoke carefully after a long silence. "Did Elena know about the rest of the family?" Richard answered, "Yes." David looked up sharply. "She knew about us?" "She knew Frank was married." That sentence landed differently. Not cruel, not defensive, just factual. I found myself wondering what kind of childhood Elena actually had. Did she wait for occasional phone calls from Frank? Birthday cards? Secret visits? Did she spend years feeling hidden too? That thought changed something inside me slightly. Because loneliness recognizes loneliness. Even across betrayal. David suddenly looked toward me. "What do you want to do?" Interesting question. For years, people mostly told me what was happening instead of asking what I wanted. Older women become adaptable because life trains us that way. You accommodate schedules, holidays, grandchildren, busy careers. Eventually, people mistake flexibility for absence. I took a slow breath. "I want to go home." David frowned immediately. "To your apartment?" I nodded. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said quietly. There it was. Concern. Late perhaps, but genuine. "I've been alone plenty," I answered gently. His face tightened. Not anger. Regret. Victoria finally spoke again. You could stay with us. The offer sounded polite, not warm. I recognized the difference. And maybe David did too, because he immediately added, "We'd like that, Mom." We. Such a small word. But after years of feeling like an occasional guest in my son's life, hearing it mattered more than I expected. Still, I shook my head softly. I need time to think. Richard stood slowly from the table. I'll arrange contact information for Elena. Something about hearing her name out loud again tightened my chest unexpectedly. Elena, Frank's daughter, the child he protected quietly for 27 years. And somehow, despite every reason not to, I couldn't stop remembering the sadness in her face at the funeral home. She looked terrified of taking up space. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. David grabbed his coat as we finally prepared to leave the office. Outside, the rain had stopped completely now. Downtown streets glistened beneath pale evening light while cold wind moved. Fallen leaves along the sidewalks. November always makes cities look tired. David held the building door open for me as we stepped outside. A simple gesture, but one he hadn't done in years. People stop noticing mothers slowly. Then suddenly one painful moment reminds them we're getting older too. Victoria walked slightly ahead toward the parking garage while David stayed beside me. Mom. Yes. He hesitated. Then quietly, were you happy with Dad? The question surprised me enough that I stopped walking for a second. 42 years old. And my son was only now asking whether his mother had been happy. I looked out across the wet street before answering. Most of the time. That was the truth. Frank betrayed me. Frank lied. Frank hid another child. And somehow, I still loved him. Marriage after nearly 40 years becomes too complicated for simple endings. David looked down at the sidewalk. I don't know if I could forgive something like this. I studied my son carefully then. Young enough to think love and betrayal can't exist together. Young enough to believe broken things always come with clear answers. At your age, I said softly, I probably would have said the same thing. We reached the parking garage elevator just as Victoria turned back toward us. David, she said carefully, your phone's been ringing nonstop. He pulled it from his coat pocket. 7 missed calls, all from the same number. The family company's chief financial officer. David frowned immediately. That's strange. Then his phone buzzed again in his hand. This time he answered. I watched his face change while he listened. Confusion first, then concern, then something heavier. When the call ended, he lowered the phone slowly. What is it? Victoria asked. David stared at us both. The company accountants found several large trust withdrawals made over the last 2 years. A cold feeling settled quietly into my stomach. Because suddenly Frank's secrets no longer felt buried safely in the past anymore. David didn't speak again until we reached the parking garage. Cold wind moved through the concrete levels carrying the smell of rain and car exhaust while his phone remained clenched tightly. In his hand, Victoria pressed the elevator button twice even though it was already lit. Nervous habit. People reveal themselves in small movements once pressure starts building. What kind of withdrawals? She asked carefully. David looked distracted. I don't know yet. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the 3 of us stepped inside. Nobody spoke during the ride down. I watched our reflections in the mirrored walls. A grieving son, a tense daughter-in-law, an old woman holding her dead husband's secrets inside her purse. Families rarely collapse all at once. Usually the cracks were already there long before anyone notices the sound. The parking garage was nearly empty by then. Evening had settled over Cedar Falls, turning the wet pavement outside dark silver beneath streetlights. David unlocked the SUV remotely. Before we reached the vehicle, his phone rang again. Same number. This time he answered immediately. Tom, slow down. He listened silently for several seconds while Victoria and I stood beside the passenger door. Then his face changed. Not panic. Recognition. Like several disconnected things suddenly made sense at once. When did this start? He asked quietly. Another pause. How much total? Victoria crossed both arms tightly against herself. I recognized that posture too. Defensiveness disguised as self-protection. David looked toward her briefly before turning away slightly. No, he said into the phone. Don't freeze anything yet. I'll handle it tonight. When the call ended, the garage felt colder somehow. Victoria stepped closer. David. He stared at the phone in silence for another second before answering. There have been repeated withdrawals from one of Dad's trust accounts for almost 2 years. My stomach tightened immediately. How much? Victoria asked. David rubbed his jaw slowly. Over 400,000. Even standing in a cold parking garage, I felt heat rise into my chest. For $100,000. Not an accounting error. Not accidental. Intentional. David looked toward me. The account was attached to one of Dad's protected family trusts. The word protected echoed strangely in my head. Frank protected Elena. Frank protected the inheritance. But apparently something inside the trust still slipped through someone's hands. Victoria spoke too quickly. Could it be business-related? David didn't answer immediately. That silence mattered. Then, quietly, the withdrawals were approved through family authorization credentials. I watched him carefully. Years of marriage teach women how to recognize suspicion before it fully forms. David wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Victoria. Very briefly, but long enough. Victoria noticed too. Her expression hardened instantly. You cannot seriously think I had something to do with this. I didn't say that. You looked at me. The tension between them changed shape right there in the parking garage. Still polite. Still controlled. But no longer united. I suddenly remembered something Frank once told me during David's engagement party years earlier. Marriage isn't tested during good years, he said quietly while watching the dance floor. It's tested when fear enters the room. At the time, I thought he meant illness. Or money problems. Now I understood better. Fear changes how people look at each other. David unlocked the driver's side door slowly. I just need facts before anyone panics. Victoria gave a short laugh under her breath. A little late for that. Nobody argued with her. The drive back to David's house took nearly 20 minutes through wet evening traffic. The windshield wipers moved steadily while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. Ordinarily, David hated silence while driving. When he was younger, he filled every car ride with conversation. Work stories, business ideas, questions about football. But tonight he barely spoke. Victoria stared out the passenger window the entire time. And I sat in the back seat thinking about Frank. About secrets. About trust. About how strange it felt that the man I loved spent years quietly building protections around a family he no longer fully trusted. By the time we reached the house, night had settled completely over the neighborhood. David's home sat at the end of a curved cul-de-sac lined with tall maple trees already stripped nearly bare for winter. Beautiful homes. Perfect lawns. Warm lights glowing behind large windows. The kind of neighborhood where people assume bad things only happen somewhere else. David unlocked the front door and motioned for me to go in first. Another small gesture I hadn't realized I missed. The house smelled faintly like vanilla candles and expensive wood polish. Victoria immediately kicked off her heels near the entryway and headed toward the kitchen. I need wine, she muttered quietly. David ignored the comment and loosened his tie while pulling out his phone again. I'm calling the accountants back. I stood alone near the living room for a moment looking at framed family photos lining the walls. Christmas mornings, beach vacations, anniversary dinners. So many smiling pictures. And suddenly I wondered how many people inside those frames were pretending. David disappeared into his office down the hallway, while Victoria poured herself a glass of white wine at the kitchen island. The silence between us felt uncomfortable now. Not openly hostile, just uncertain. She finally looked toward me. You think I took the money too, don't you? Interesting she used the word too. I answered honestly. I don't know what to think yet. Victoria looked exhausted suddenly. Not glamorous. Not polished. Just tired. For the record, she said quietly, I didn't know anything about trust withdrawals. I nodded once. But she kept talking. I knew Frank supported someone privately. She hesitated. I just didn't know it was another daughter. That caught my attention immediately. You knew? Victoria looked down at her wine glass. Not officially. Then how? She exhaled slowly. About 3 years ago, I found paperwork while organizing the home office. Her eyes lifted carefully toward me. Tuition payments. Apartment expenses in Portland. Things that didn't make sense. My chest tightened. And you never told me. Victoria gave a sad little smile. I thought maybe you already knew. That hurt more than I expected. Because apparently everyone in the family believed I understood more than I did. Even while I sat quietly at holiday dinners, smiling through conversations built around secrets. Victoria looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Frank asked me not to say anything. Why? He said he was trying to protect everyone. There was that word again. Protect. Funny how often people use that word while hiding painful truths. Down the hallway, David's office door suddenly opened harder than necessary. He walked back into the kitchen holding several printed bank statements in one hand. His expression looked colder now. Controlled. Dangerously controlled. What happened? Victoria asked immediately. David dropped the papers onto the counter. The withdrawals weren't random. Nobody moved. They all went to the same secondary account. My stomach tightened. And? Victoria asked carefully. David looked directly at her this time. The account holder's name is Victoria Harrison. The kitchen went completely silent after David said Victoria's name. Not shocked silence. The kind of silence that changes a family permanently. Victoria stared at him across the marble kitchen island, wine glass still frozen halfway to her lips. What? David slid the printed bank statements closer toward her. The secondary account receiving the withdrawals is under your authorization. She looked down at the paperwork quickly, then back at him, then at me. And for the first time since Frank's funeral, I saw a real panic cross her face. This has to be wrong. David didn't answer immediately. That worried me more than anger would have. Because when people stop reacting emotionally, it usually means they're already rearranging trust inside their heads. Victoria set the wine glass down carefully. I swear to you, David, I never touched Frank's trust. Her voice sounded steady at first. Too steady. Then it cracked slightly near the end. David rubbed one hand over his mouth tiredly. The transfer started almost 2 years ago. Victoria shook her head immediately. No, the account belongs to you. No, the account exists under my name, she corrected quickly. That doesn't mean I authorized those withdrawals. Interesting distinction. I watched both of them carefully while soft kitchen lights reflected across wet windows behind the sink. Outside, cold wind moved through the trees lining the cul-de-sac. Inside, something much quieter was breaking apart. David pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat down heavily. When were you planning to tell me you knew about Elena? Victoria looked stunned for half a second, then defensive. I already explained that. You explained you found paperwork. That's true. And somehow you decided not to mention my father secretly supporting another woman for decades. Victoria's face tightened. I thought he was having an affair. David gave a short, bitter laugh. He was. The room went still again. I lowered my eyes toward my wedding ring. Funny thing about betrayal after nearly 40 years of marriage. The affair hurts, but the lies surrounding it hurt more. Victoria crossed both arms tightly. Frank begged me not to say anything. David stared at her. And you thought protecting his secret mattered more than telling my mother? There it was. Not just anger. Disappointment. Much heavier. Victoria looked toward me quickly. I never wanted to hurt you, Margaret. I believed her. Oddly enough, I did. Because most family damage doesn't come from people trying to be evil. It comes from people trying to protect themselves first. David suddenly stood again and walked toward the refrigerator before stopping halfway there. What else don't I know? Nobody answered immediately. That question didn't belong only to Victoria anymore. It belonged to the entire family. I sat quietly at the kitchen island remembering the last Thanksgiving Frank attended before his health declined badly. Victoria had spent the entire evening refilling wine glasses and smiling through dinner conversation while Frank barely touched his food. At one point I caught him watching David laugh from across the table. There were tears in his eyes. I thought it was gratitude. Now I think it was guilt. Victoria finally pulled one of the papers toward herself. These transfers, she frowned. I've never even seen this account number before. David leaned against the counter watching her carefully. You expect me to believe someone used your name without you noticing? Her expression sharpened instantly. You think I'm stealing from your mother? That's not what I said. It's exactly what you're thinking. The tension between them had changed completely now. No softness left. No automatic unity. Just two people suddenly realizing trust had become fragile. I looked toward David. She deserves the chance to explain. Victoria's eyes flickered toward me immediately. Gratitude mixed with surprise. David exhaled heavily through his nose. Fine. Victoria sat down slowly across from him. For a moment, she looked much younger than 40. Not glamorous. Not polished. Just frightened. My father invested badly after retirement, she said quietly. About 2 years ago, he lost almost everything. David frowned. You never told me that. Because he was ashamed. That sounded believable. Men from that generation often tied their self-worth directly to financial stability. Victoria continued carefully. I help my parents sometimes. She swallowed. But nothing close to this amount. David looked down at the statements again. The transfers total over $400,000. Even saying the number aloud made the room feel heavier. $400,000. Enough money to change lives. Destroy marriages. Reveal character. I thought about my own apartment suddenly. The broken heater last winter. Generic grocery brands. The way I stretched prescriptions longer than recommended some months. All while money quietly disappeared around me. Not because I lacked support. Because I never knew support existed. That realization hurt more than I expected. Victoria rubbed both hands together nervously. Can I see the transfer dates? David slid the papers toward her. She studied them carefully under the kitchen lights. Then her face changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. What? David asked immediately. Victoria looked up slowly. These transfers happened while Frank was still handling trust operations himself. The room went quiet again. Because she was right. Frank hadn't become seriously ill until 8 months ago. Before that, he personally controlled most family financial structures. David frowned. You think Dad moved the money himself? Victoria hesitated. I think. She looked down at the statements again. I think he may have been using my dormant account temporarily. David stared at her blankly. For what? She swallowed. I don't know. But something in her voice told me she had a theory. And suddenly, I remembered another strange moment from the previous spring. Frank sitting at our kitchen table late at night, sorting documents after everyone else left Easter dinner. I asked why he looked worried. He answered, sometimes protecting people gets messy. At the time, I thought he meant business problems. Now I wasn't sure anymore. David suddenly grabbed one of the papers from the counter. These transfers line up with the Portland property expenses. Victoria looked up sharply. The apartment? He nodded slowly. Elena. Nobody moved. The room suddenly felt smaller. Like all of Frank's hidden worlds were beginning to overlap. Victoria looked genuinely confused now. You think your father was routing money through my account to hide support payments? David rubbed both hands over his face. I don't know what to think anymore. That sentence hurt me deeply. Because confusion inside families spreads faster than anger. Once trust cracks, every memory becomes suspicious retroactively. Every conversation. Every kindness. Every silence. I stood slowly from the stool and walked toward the sink. Warm water filled the silence while I rinsed my untouched teacup carefully. Small, ordinary movements help during emotional storms. Behind me, Victoria spoke quietly. There's something else. David looked exhausted already. What now? She stared at the transfer records. The account linked to these withdrawals, her voice lowered. Frank opened it in my name before our wedding. I turned around slowly. David frowned immediately. What? Victoria looked pale. He said it was for future family investments. The cold feeling returned instantly to my stomach. Because suddenly this situation no longer looked like random theft. It looked planned. And dead men are very difficult to question once their secrets start unfolding. Nobody slept much that night. Around 1 in the morning, I stood alone in David's kitchen wearing one of Frank's old cardigans over my nightgown while the coffee maker hummed softly beside me. The house felt too quiet for 3 people carrying that many secrets. Upstairs, I could hear faint footsteps moving back and forth across the bedroom floor. David, pacing. When he was little, he paced whenever he got anxious about school or baseball tryouts. Frank used to joke that our son worried with his whole body. Apparently, adulthood hadn't changed that. I wrapped both hands around a warm coffee mug and stared out the dark kitchen windows toward the empty cul-de-sac. A few snowflakes had started falling. Early for November. My reflection looked older tonight. Not weak. Just tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Funny how betrayal ages memories faster than faces. The back staircase creaked softly behind me. David entered the kitchen still wearing slacks and a wrinkled dress shirt, sleeves rolled unevenly to his elbows. He looked exhausted. You should be sleeping, I said gently. He gave a tired little smile. So should you. Fair enough. He opened the refrigerator, stared inside for several seconds without taking anything, then shut it again. That alone told me how overwhelmed he felt. David always ate when stressed. Finally, he sat across from me at the kitchen island. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, did Dad ever mention opening accounts in Victoria's name? I shook my head slowly. No, David rubbed one hand over his face. I keep trying to make this make sense. That sentence carried more pain than anger. Because confusion inside families feels personal. It forces you to reconsider memories you once trusted completely. I looked down into my coffee. Your father spent the last few years trying to control damage quietly. David frowned. What does that mean? I hesitated. Not because I wanted to protect Frank anymore. Because I was finally starting to understand him myself. When people carry guilt long enough, I said softly, they stop making clean decisions. David stared at the counter silently. Then he asked something unexpected. Were you happy after I moved out? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was cruel. Because it arrived about 15 years too late. I smiled faintly. You're asking now? His face tightened immediately. I know. And he did know. That was the painful part. Children rarely notice the exact moment parents become lonely. The world trains them forward while older people quietly learn how to stay behind gracefully. I missed having noise in the house, I admitted softly. Your father worked constantly back then. You were building your life. Most days it was just me and daytime television. David lowered his eyes. I thought you liked quiet. I learned to tolerate quiet. Big difference. The refrigerator motor hummed softly in the silence that followed. Then David looked up again. You know what bothers me most? What? I can't tell if Dad was protecting Elena, he paused heavily, or hiding her from us because he didn't trust us. That question settled deep inside me, because I'd wondered the same thing all evening. Frank protected Elena financially, protected me legally, protected the trust carefully. But people only build complicated protections when they fear something collapsing. The question was, what exactly frightened him? Before I could answer, footsteps sounded softly from the upstairs hallway. Victoria appeared near the kitchen entrance wearing gray cashmere sweats and no makeup for the first time in years. Without all the polished perfection, she looked younger. More fragile, too. She stopped when she saw us both awake. I didn't realize anyone else was up. David didn't answer. That silence hurt her immediately. I saw it happen across her face. Marriage changes most painfully through silence. Victoria walked slowly toward the island. I made tea, she said quietly, holding up a mug slightly. Nobody responded. She sat down anyway. For several seconds, the three of us remained there listening to snow tap lightly against the windows. Then Victoria spoke carefully. I checked the old account records. David finally looked toward her. And she swallowed. The account Frank opened before our wedding wasn't technically under my personal authorization. What does that mean? It means, she looked down at her tea. Frank remained primary controller the entire time. David frowned. So he used your name. Victoria nodded once. As a secondary shield. Interesting wording. Shield. Again with the language of protection. I leaned slightly forward. Protection from who? Victoria hesitated too long before answering. That's what scares me. The kitchen went still. David's voice lowered carefully. What are you talking about? Victoria looked genuinely uncomfortable now. About a year ago, Frank asked me strange questions. Something cold settled quietly into my stomach. What kind of questions? David asked. She stared down into her mug. He asked whether I thought people changed once money became involved. Nobody spoke. Then she continued. He also asked if you trusted the board members at the company completely. David frowned immediately. My board. Victoria nodded. At the time I thought he was just stressed from the treatments. But now none of us knew what to think. I suddenly remembered another conversation from last winter. Frank sitting beside the fireplace after everyone left Christmas dinner. He asked, if something happened to me suddenly, do you think David would slow down enough to notice what matters? At the time I thought it was sadness talking. Now it sounded almost like worry. David stood abruptly from the stool and paced toward the kitchen windows. Outside, snow had started covering the neighborhood lawns in thin white layers. Everything looked softer from a distance. That's impossible, he muttered. Victoria looked up carefully. What is? My father trusted the company more than anyone. But even while saying it, uncertainty entered his voice. Because grief changes memory. Once doubt appears, old conversations start sounding different retroactively. David turned back toward us. Tom mentioned something else tonight. Victoria straightened slightly. What? The accountants only noticed the withdrawals because someone recently tried accessing the trust again. My stomach tightened immediately. When? Yesterday morning. The room fell silent. Yesterday morning. The day Frank died. Victoria slowly set her tea mug down. Who tried accessing it? David looked directly at her. The login request came from inside this house. Nobody moved after David said the login. Request came from inside the house. The kitchen suddenly felt much smaller. Too warm. Too quiet. Snow continued falling softly outside while the three of us stared at each other across the island beneath dim, pendant lights. Victoria spoke first. What exactly are you implying? David crossed both arms tightly. I'm not implying anything. Yes, you are. His jaw tightened. The access request came from our home network yesterday morning, Victoria. The morning your father died, she whispered. Nobody needed to repeat that part. The timing already sat heavily in the room. I looked down at the steam rising from my coffee cup. Yesterday morning, while Frank lay unconscious in a hospital room, someone accessed the family trust system from this house. A strange sadness settled over me then. Not outrage, just exhaustion, because grief should have been enough for one family already. Victoria stood slowly from the stool. I didn't touch anything. David didn't answer immediately. That silence frightened her more than accusations would have. I'm serious, she said. I didn't even know the passwords. The request used your secondary authorization credentials. That doesn't prove I logged in. David rubbed one hand across his face tiredly. You were home yesterday morning. So were you. That stopped him. Interesting how quickly fear changes conversations between married people. Not louder. Sharper. David stared toward the kitchen floor for several seconds before speaking again. The system flagged unusual activity because someone attempted to move assets connected to the Oregon property. My stomach tightened instantly. The lake house? Victoria asked. David nodded once. I remembered Richard mentioning the Oregon property earlier that afternoon. Frank had separated it from the primary trust structure before his death. At the time, I barely thought about it. Now suddenly it mattered. Victoria slowly sat back down. I swear to you, David, I don't know anything about this. And strangely enough, I believe she believed that. Not innocence exactly, but confusion. Real confusion has a different texture than manipulation. The refrigerator hummed softly in the silence. Then I asked the question sitting quietly in the middle of the room. Did Frank ever mention the Oregon property to either of you? David shook his head immediately. No, Victoria hesitated. That caught my attention. Victoria? She looked uncomfortable again. About 6 months ago, Frank asked me to locate some old renovation paperwork related to the lake house. David frowned. What lake house? The room went still. Victoria blinked. You didn't know? No. Her face lost color slightly. I thought. She stopped herself. What? David asked sharply. I thought your father already told you. There it was again. Another hidden room inside the family. Another secret nobody realized belonged only to them. Victoria looked toward me carefully. The property was purchased 3 years ago through one of Frank's holding companies. I stared at her blankly. A lake house. She nodded once. In Oregon, near Cannon Beach. David looked genuinely stunned now. My father bought property on the West Coast and never mentioned it to me. Victoria wrapped both hands around her mug. He said it was supposed to be quiet. Quiet. Frank used that word often near the end of his life. I just want somewhere quiet eventually. At the time, I assumed he meant retirement. Now I wondered whether he meant escape. David paced slowly toward the windows again. This is insane. No one corrected him. Because it did sound insane. Secret daughter. Hidden trust accounts. Private property. Unauthorized access requests. And somewhere inside all of it rested a man I spent 38 years loving. I suddenly realized something painful then. You never fully know another person. Not completely. Not even after decades. Victoria looked toward me softly. He wanted you to have the lake house. That surprised both David and me. What? David asked. She swallowed carefully. When Frank asked me for the renovation paperwork, he said, her voice lowered. He said Margaret deserved somewhere peaceful after everything. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Because that sounded exactly like Frank. Not dramatic love. Quiet guilt expressed through practical gestures. I turned slightly toward the dark kitchen. Windows. Snow covered the backyard now in thin white layers beneath the patio lights. Frank always loved snow. He said it made the world look forgiven for a little while. David finally stopped pacing. Why wouldn't he tell Mom about any of this? Nobody answered immediately. Because deep down, I think we all knew. Frank spent years hiding truths until secrecy became habit. Even his kindness arrived wrapped in silence. Victoria looked down at her tea again. There's something else I didn't mention earlier. David let out a slow breath. Of course there is. But this time his voice sounded tired rather than angry. Victoria ignored the comment. The Oregon property wasn't completely empty. A cold feeling returned instantly to my stomach. What does that mean? David asked. She hesitated too long. Then quietly. Someone's been living there. Nobody moved. I stared at her carefully. Elena. Victoria nodded once. The room went silent except for the faint ticking clock near the hallway. Everything suddenly connected differently. The tuition payments. The apartment expenses. The hidden trust transfers. The protected property. Frank hadn't just supported Elena quietly. He built an entire separate life around protecting her. David sat down heavily at the island again. My God. He sounded less angry now. More wounded. Because betrayal from a parent feels strangely personal, even when it happened long before you understood adult life. Victoria looked toward him carefully. I don't think your father was trying to replace anyone. No. David laughed bitterly. Because it sounds like he built another family. That's not fair, I said softly before I could stop myself. Both of them looked at me. And honestly, I surprised myself too. But sitting there in the warm kitchen while snow fell outside, I suddenly remembered something important about Frank. He was flawed. Deeply flawed. But he loved fiercely once guilt attached itself to someone. That was his weakness. He tried to save everyone. Even when saving everyone required lying to the people closest to him. David stared at me quietly. You're defending him? I shook my head slowly. No, I folded my hands together. I'm trying to understand him. There's a difference. Older women learned that eventually. Young people want clean villains. Long marriages teach you human beings are rarely that simple. Victoria suddenly looked toward David again. There's one more reason the trust system flagged activity yesterday. He closed his eyes briefly like he physically couldn't handle another secret. What now? Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. The login attempt happened less than 20 minutes after Elena arrived in Cedar Falls. The kitchen went completely still, because suddenly the timing no longer felt accidental anymore. Nobody spoke after Victoria mentioned Elena arriving in Cedar Falls the same morning the trust system was accessed. The kitchen felt colder suddenly, even with the heat running softly through the vents. Snow continued drifting outside the windows, covering the backyard in quiet white layers while the three of us sat frozen around the island. David finally broke the silence. You think Elena tried accessing the trust? Victoria shook her head immediately. I don't know, but you brought it up. Because the timing matters. David stood again and walked toward the sink, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands. I recognized that posture. Frank used to stand exactly the same way whenever he felt trapped between anger and disappointment. Funny how sons inherit emotional habits without realizing it. This is unbelievable, David muttered quietly. No one argued with him. Because somewhere between the funeral home and midnight coffee, our family story had stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like unraveling. I looked down at the brass storage key still resting beside my coffee mug. Frank wanted me and Elena to open the storage unit together. Not David. Not the attorney. Elena. That choice suddenly mattered much more than before. Victoria carefully pushed her tea mug aside. There's another reason I mentioned the timing. David looked exhausted already. What now? Her eyes lifted slowly toward him. The login request didn't succeed. He frowned. So, Victoria swallowed once. The system rejected the security answers. The room went still again. David stared at her. How do you know that? For the first time all night, Victoria looked genuinely trapped. Not defensive. Cornered. Because she realized she'd said more than she intended. She hesitated. Frank showed me the system once last year after the company audit. David's voice lowered immediately. You told me you didn't know the passwords. I don't. Then how do you know the login failed? Victoria opened her mouth. Closed it. Then quietly. Because I was there. Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives before marriages change forever. I watched my son's face carefully. Not anger first. Hurt. Always hurt first when trust breaks inside families. David spoke slowly now. You were home yesterday morning, trying to access the trust. Victoria nodded once. Tears filled her eyes instantly. But not for the reasons you think. He laughed softly under his breath. That sentence never means anything good. I should have interrupted. Maybe protected them both from what came next. But older women eventually learn something difficult. Truth delayed only grows heavier. Victoria wiped beneath her eyes quickly. I thought Frank changed the trust again before he died. David stared at her blankly. What? She looked toward me briefly before continuing. A few weeks ago, Frank asked strange questions about the Oregon property and the distributions. Her voice trembled slightly. He sounded worried. Worried about what? He kept asking whether I thought the family would stay together after he was gone. That sounded painfully familiar. Frank asked me almost the same thing 2 months earlier while sitting beside me on the porch during sunset. Do you think people still choose family when money becomes involved? At the time, I thought he was reflecting on mortality. Now it sounded more like fear. Victoria twisted her fingers together nervously. Yesterday morning, after the hospital called, she swallowed hard. I panicked. David's face hardened. So you tried accessing the trust. I just wanted to see if he changed anything. Why? The question hit the room heavily. Why? Not did you? But why? Victoria looked exhausted suddenly. Not glamorous. Not composed. Just deeply tired. Because I was scared, she whispered. David stared at her in disbelief. Scared of what? Her answer came almost too quietly to hear. That once Frank died, everything would change. And there it was. The truth beneath the truth. Not greed exactly. Fear. Fear of instability. Fear of losing security. Fear of uncertainty entering a carefully controlled life. I understood it more than I wanted to. Because older women know what insecurity feels like too. Just differently. David paced toward the living room and back again. So instead of talking to me, you tried accessing my father's trust behind my back. Victoria's tears finally slipped down her cheeks. I didn't move anything. That's not the point. No, she whispered. The point is I stopped trusting this family long before yesterday. That sentence changed the room. Even David stopped moving. I looked at her carefully. Not because I agreed. Because honesty had finally entered the conversation without performance attached to it. Victoria stared down at the marble counter while speaking softly. Frank lied to everyone for decades. She laughed weakly through tears. You think that doesn't poison people eventually? Nobody answered. Because she wasn't entirely wrong. Secrets spread damage quietly through families long before they're exposed. David leaned against the doorway. So you thought there was more hidden money? Victoria looked up immediately. I thought there might be changes nobody warned us about. Us. Interesting word choice again. Not you. Us. She still saw herself inside the family structure even while it cracked around her. I suddenly remembered something Elena said at the funeral home. He never stopped loving you. Not them. You. That distinction mattered now. Frank spent years trying to protect multiple lives at once. And somewhere inside all that protection, trust slowly disappeared from everyone. I reached for my coffee cup slowly. Cold now. Like the room. Did Frank know you accessed the system? I asked quietly. Victoria shook her head. No, then how did you know the security questions? She hesitated, then answered carefully. One of them involved David's childhood nickname. David frowned immediately. What? Victoria looked embarrassed now. Frank used personal family memories as backup verification. That hurt unexpectedly, because it sounded exactly like Frank. A man trying to build emotional safety into financial systems while quietly destroying emotional safety everywhere else. David sat down heavily across from her. So what happened yesterday morning exactly? Victoria inhaled slowly. I got the hospital call around 8:30. She wiped her eyes. Afterward, I came downstairs, opened Frank's trust portal from the office computer, and tried reviewing the Oregon property files. And the system locked me out after 2 failed verification attempts. I looked at her carefully. What were you trying to find? Her answer came instantly this time. The beneficiary list. The room went silent again. Because now the fear sounded clearer. Not theft. Replacement. Victoria was terrified Frank left everything to someone else. David stared at his wife quietly for several long seconds. Then softly. You thought my father trusted a stranger more than us. Victoria looked down. I think part of him did. Nobody knew how to answer that. Because deep down, we were all starting to believe it too. Nobody said much after that. The kitchen had grown quiet in a different way now. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just emotionally tired. Snow continued falling outside while the clock above the stove crept past 2 in the morning. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but none of us bothered making fresh pots anymore. At some point during the night, grief had quietly transformed into honesty. And honesty is exhausting. David remained seated across from Victoria, elbows resting on his knees, staring down at the hardwood floor like he no longer recognized the shape of his own life. Victoria sat motionless beside the island, arms wrapped around herself tightly. And I watched both of them realizing something painful. Frank's secret hadn't created distance inside this family. It revealed distance that already existed. That's the thing about hidden truths. They don't invent cracks. They expose them. Finally, David spoke. Did you ever resent my mother? Victoria looked up immediately. What? The trust. The family money. Everything. His voice stayed calm. Did you ever feel like she mattered more than you? Her expression changed instantly. Not anger. Recognition. Because she knew the question came from something deeper. Victoria stared down at her hands for several seconds before answering. Yes. The honesty stunned all of us. Even her. I didn't want to, she whispered quickly. But sometimes, yes. David leaned back slowly in his chair. I remained very still. At my age, you learn people become most truthful when they're too emotionally exhausted to keep performing. Victoria swallowed hard. Your father adored Margaret. Her voice trembled slightly. Even when he disappointed her, even when he lied, everything still revolved around her emotionally. The words hurt. Not because they were cruel, because they were probably true. Frank loved me deeply, and somehow still betrayed me anyway. Long marriages become complicated enough to hold both things simultaneously. Victoria looked toward me carefully. I spent years trying to become indispensable to this family. I thought about all the holidays she hosted perfectly, the expensive dinners, the organized vacations, the careful image of success she wrapped around David's life. Not fake exactly, just constructed. And eventually, she continued softly, I realized no matter what I did, part of Frank still saw me as temporary. The room went quiet again. David frowned. That's ridiculous. Is it? She asked gently. He didn't answer. Because deep down, I think he understood something too. Frank never fully trusted permanence. Not after years of secrets. Not after building separate emotional worlds around separate people. Victoria wiped beneath her eyes slowly. When Elena appeared at the funeral, she laughed weakly. I suddenly realized your father spent decades preparing for possibilities while the rest of us were just living day to day. I looked toward the dark windows. Snow covered the backyard completely now. Everything looked peaceful from a distance. That thought kept returning tonight. Families look peaceful from outside too. David finally spoke again. So what now? Simple question. Impossible answer. Victoria looked at him carefully. I don't know. And strangely enough, that may have been the most honest thing anyone said all night. Nobody knew anymore. Not about the trust. Not about Frank. Not even about each other. I suddenly remembered the unopened envelope Elena gave me at the funeral home, still sitting inside my purse near the kitchen chair. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten it existed. Almost. I reached down slowly and pulled it into my lap. David noticed immediately. What's that? Elena gave it to me after the service. Victoria straightened slightly. You never opened it? I shook my head. Not yet. The envelope looked softer now from being carried around all evening. Frank's familiar handwriting stretched carefully across the front. For Margaret. No anger rose inside me looking at it now. Just sadness. And curiosity. David leaned forward slightly. You should read it. Part of me didn't want to. Because unopened letters still contain possibility. Once opened, truth becomes permanent. But another part of me was tired of carrying unfinished things. So I carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested several folded pages and a small photograph. The picture slipped into my lap first. I picked it up slowly. And suddenly the room disappeared around me. It was Frank. Much younger. Maybe mid-50s. Standing beside a teenage Elena near an ocean cliff somewhere along the Oregon coast. His arm rested awkwardly around her shoulders like a father still learning how to belong in his daughter's life. But what shattered me wasn't Frank. It was Elena's smile. Because she looked genuinely happy. Not spoiled. Not manipulative. Not calculating. Just loved. My chest tightened painfully. David noticed immediately. What is it? I handed him the photograph silently. His face changed as he studied it. For the first time all night, his anger softened into something closer to grief. That's Dad, he whispered unnecessarily. Victoria leaned closer carefully. And suddenly all three of us sat there staring at proof that Frank's hidden life had been painfully real for years. Not fantasy. Not scandal. A real human relationship. I unfolded the letter next. Margaret, If you're reading this, then I've already failed at telling the truth while I still had time. The kitchen remained completely silent while I read. Elena never asked for any of this. Neither did you. I spent years trying to separate my mistakes from the people I loved, but life doesn't work that way. Secrets spread quietly into everything. I paused there, because that sentence felt painfully accurate now. Frank continued. You once asked me why I bought property in Oregon even though we never planned to move there together. The truth is, I wanted to leave both of you something peaceful after I was gone. Both of you. Not competing women. Not divided families. Just two people he loved differently and failed differently. My eyes blurred briefly. David sat motionless across from me while I continued reading. The lake house belongs to Margaret fully. But I asked Elena to stay there temporarily because she had nowhere stable left after graduate school. Please don't punish her for my failures. There it was. The truth finally settling clearly into place. Frank wasn't hiding a second family. He was trying desperately to hold together two broken responsibilities at once. And somewhere inside that impossible balancing act, he slowly destroyed himself. At the very bottom of the letter, one final sentence waited. There's something inside the storage unit I never found the courage to show either of you while I was alive. My hands tightened slightly around the paper, because suddenly the storage key sitting beside my cold coffee felt heavier than ever before. Nobody spoke for a long time after I finished reading Frank's letter. The kitchen had grown almost painfully quiet. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the backyard lights while the clock on the stove quietly turned past 3 in the morning. David still held the photograph of Frank and Elena in his hands. Victoria stared down at the marble counter like she no longer trusted her own thoughts. And I sat there realizing something unexpected. For the first time since Frank died, I no longer felt angry at him. Hurt, yes. Disappointed, certainly. But underneath all of it, I finally saw the truth clearly. Frank had spent years trying to carry guilt quietly instead of risking honesty loudly. And eventually the weight crushed everyone around him. David finally looked up from the photograph. She looks happy with him. His voice sounded softer now. Not forgiving, just grieving. I nodded slowly. She probably waited a long time for moments like that. The room fell silent again, because all three of us understood what that meant. Secret children don't grow up inside normal memories. No public birthdays. No family vacations. No father-daughter photos displayed proudly on mantles. Everything happens quietly. Hidden. Careful. Victoria wrapped both hands around her mug again. I can't stop thinking about the funeral. I looked toward her. She sat alone the entire time, Victoria whispered. She looked terrified to even be there. That stayed with me too. Elena didn't arrive demanding money or attention. She arrived like someone unsure whether she even deserved grief publicly. David leaned back slowly in his chair. My father spent 27 years dividing himself between two lives. I looked down at Frank's letter resting in my lap. No, I said quietly. I think he spent 27 years failing to combine them. That changed something in David's expression immediately, because it was true. Frank didn't build a glamorous secret life. He built a second responsibility. And responsibilities age people differently than romance does. I remembered the final year before his illness worsened. The insomnia. The distracted conversations. The constant exhaustion in his eyes. At the time, I blamed retirement stress. Now I understood guilt had probably been sitting beside us at every dinner table for years. Victoria suddenly looked toward me carefully. Do you hate him? Interesting question. Not, did you love him? Did you hate him? I thought about it honestly before answering. No, both of them looked surprised. I smiled faintly. When you're married nearly 40 years, love stops being simple enough for hate to replace it completely. That was the truth older people understand eventually. Long marriages survive thousands of ordinary days, shared illnesses, mortgage payments, funerals, birthdays, job losses, quiet mornings drinking coffee beside each other. One terrible truth can damage love deeply, but it doesn't erase decades automatically. David lowered his eyes toward the photograph again. I don't know how to feel about him anymore. You don't have to decide tonight. He nodded slowly. And for the first time since the funeral, he looked less like an executive trying to solve a crisis and more like a son mourning his father honestly. Victoria finally stood from the kitchen stool. I'm going upstairs. David looked up immediately. Not angry, just tired. You okay? She gave a weak little laugh. Honestly, no. That answer felt refreshing after an entire night filled with half-truths and emotional calculations. Before leaving the kitchen, Victoria paused beside me. "I really am sorry, Margaret." I studied her face carefully. No makeup now. No polished confidence. No perfectly managed expressions. Just a woman realizing control cannot fix emotional damage once trust collapses. "I know," I answered softly. And strangely enough, I meant it. After she disappeared upstairs, David remained seated across from me in silence. Snow tapped lightly against the windows while the heater hummed softly through the vents. Then he asked the question I think had been haunting him all night. "Do you think Dad loved Elena more?" My chest tightened unexpectedly. Not because the question offended me, because children never fully outgrow fear of being emotionally replaced. Even at 42, I shook my head slowly. "No, then why all the secrecy?" I looked toward the dark backyard. "Because shame makes people hide things they care about most." David stayed quiet. I continued softly. "Your father wasn't protecting a mistress." I glanced toward the photograph in his hands. He was protecting a daughter he believed the world might judge unfairly. David rubbed his thumb across the edge of the photograph. "She still got judged unfairly." "Yes." Silence again. Then quietly, "So did you." That nearly broke my heart. Because after all these years, my son finally saw something I'd hidden too well. Not the affair, the loneliness around it. I reached across the counter and touched his hand gently. "We all miss things." But David shook his head immediately. No, his voice cracked slightly. I stopped paying attention. The honesty in that sentence hurt more than blame would have. Because he was right. Not cruelly right. Just painfully human. I thought about all the times I almost mentioned feeling lonely and stopped myself instead. All the dinners I pretended not to mind eating alone. All the birthdays shortened into quick phone calls. All the moments I chose silence because I didn't want to interrupt his busy life. Families drift gradually. That's what makes it dangerous. Nobody notices the distance growing until something tragic shines light on it. David suddenly sat straighter. "The storage unit." I looked up. "What about it?" "We should open it tomorrow." The brass key still rested beside my coffee cup under the kitchen lights. Small, ordinary, heavy with unfinished truth. I nodded slowly. "Yes." David hesitated. "Do you want me to come with you?" Interesting. Frank specifically asked for Elena and me, not David. And somehow I understood why now. This final truth wasn't really about inheritance anymore. It was about acknowledgement. About the two women Frank spent years trying to protect separately, finally standing in the same room together. "I think Elena should be there," I answered gently. David nodded once. No jealousy. No anger. Just acceptance. Outside, snow finally stopped falling. The neighborhood looked perfectly still beneath the pale streetlights. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then David quietly asked, "Do you think she'll hate us?" The question caught me off guard. Why would she? He stared down at the photograph. Because she spent her whole life hidden while I got everything publicly. That sentence settled heavily into the kitchen. Because deep down, I think David finally understood the real tragedy of Frank's secret. Not the affair. Not the inheritance. The loneliness. Elena's loneliness. Mine. Even Frank's. 3 separate lives orbiting around silence for decades. I stood slowly from the stool and reached for the storage key. Cold metal. Against my palm. Tomorrow, whatever waited inside that unit would finally force all of us to stop living around the truth. And honestly, I wasn't sure any of us were ready for that, yet the snow had stopped by morning. Sunlight stretched softly across David's kitchen when I came downstairs just after 7, turning the marble counters pale gold beneath the windows. For the first time in days, the house felt quiet without tension inside it. Not peaceful exactly, just honest. David stood near the stove making coffee in wrinkled clothes from the day before. He looked exhausted, but calmer somehow. Grief had finally replaced confusion in his face. And grief, strangely enough, is easier to survive than uncertainty. "You sleep at all?" he asked gently when he noticed me. "A little." That was enough at our age. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen while soft morning light touched the snow-covered backyard outside. For a moment, everything looked ordinary again. Then I saw the brass storage key still resting beside the fruit bowl on the counter. And reality returned. David handed me a coffee mug. 2 sugars. He remembered. That small detail nearly undid me more than everything else. "Victoria left early," he said quietly. I looked up. "Where?" "She went to her sister's house for a few days." His voice remained calm, but sadness lived underneath it now. Not rage, not blame, just the exhaustion of realizing a marriage had quietly changed shape overnight. I nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then David finally asked, "Are you sure you want to do this today?" I looked at the storage key. No, he almost smiled at that. Me neither. Around 10 o'clock, Elena arrived. I recognized her immediately through the front windows before David even opened the door. Same dark coat from the funeral. Same nervous posture. Same careful hesitation before entering someone else's space. She looked frightened. Not greedy. Not entitled. Just frightened. And suddenly my heart broke for her completely. Because children always carry the weight of adults' secrets eventually. David opened the door quietly. "Elena." She nodded once. "Hi." Her voice sounded small inside the large entryway. I walked toward her slowly. For a second, neither of us knew what to say. Then she looked at me with tears already forming in her eyes. "I almost didn't come." I believe that too. People who spend their lives hidden usually learn not to expect welcome. I touched her arm gently. "You're here now." That seemed to steady her slightly. The drive to the storage facility took almost 40 minutes through snow-covered roads outside Cedar Falls. Elena sat quietly in the back seat while David drove. Nobody played music. Nobody talked much. But strangely enough, the silence no longer felt hostile, just uncertain. I watched Elena carefully through the rearview mirror a few times during the drive. Frank's eyes, Frank's hands, even the way she stared thoughtfully out windows reminded me of him. And instead of anger, I felt grief for all the years we lost to secrecy. The storage facility sat outside town, near an industrial highway lined with frozen fields and telephone poles. Gray metal buildings, security fences, rows of numbered units beneath pale winter sunlight. Ordinary place for something carrying so much emotional weight. David unlocked the office door while I held the brass key tightly in my coat pocket. The manager led us quietly toward the back row of units. "Number 214, he said politely before leaving us alone. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Elena spoke softly beside me. "He used to bring me here sometimes." David looked at her immediately. "What's inside?" She shook her head slowly. "I never knew." My chest tightened. Even Elena only stood near the edges of Frank's secrets. I stepped forward finally and slid the brass key into the lock. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from finality. Then I opened the door. Inside sat a small room filled with carefully organized boxes, old furniture, framed photographs, and shelves of labeled binders. Not treasure, not hidden money. A life. An entire hidden life. David stared silently around the unit. Elena covered her mouth with one shaking hand. And I stood frozen beside the doorway looking at photographs lining the back wall. Frank and Elena at high school graduation. Frank teaching her to fish beside the Oregon lake. Frank smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years. Not because he loved her more. Because guilt had made every moment precious. I walked slowly farther inside. There were scrapbooks, birthday cards, medical records, tuition receipts. 27 years of quiet fatherhood stored carefully inside metal walls. David picked up one framed photo slowly. It showed Frank standing beside both children separately years apart. Young David at age 8, holding a baseball glove. Teenage Elena holding college acceptance papers. Same expression on Frank's face in both pictures. Pride. Real pride. David swallowed hard. He loved her. "Yes," I answered softly. Then after a pause, "He loved you too." That mattered. Because children should never feel abandoned emotionally by truths they never caused. Elena wiped tears from her cheeks quietly. "He always talked about you," she whispered suddenly. I looked toward her. "He said you were the best thing that ever happened to him." My throat tightened painfully. Funny how love survives even inside terrible choices. Near the back wall sat one final object covered carefully with a white sheet. David pulled the fabric away slowly. Underneath rested a wooden sign. Hand-painted. Simple. And suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. Because I recognized it immediately. It was from the Oregon Lake house. The small cottage Frank secretly bought years earlier. Painted across the wood in faded blue letters were the words, "Harrison Family Retreat, not Elena's house." Not a secret second family. A place Frank hoped might someday hold everyone together. And suddenly, all the confusion of the past 2 days settled quietly into heartbreaking clarity. Frank never stopped loving his family. He just lacked the courage to trust truth more than silence. David sat down heavily on one of the storage boxes, covering his eyes briefly with one hand. Elena cried quietly beside the photographs, and I stood there in the middle of Frank's hidden life realizing something unexpected. The inheritance was never the real story. Not the $20 million. Not the trust. Not the properties. The real inheritance was loneliness, passed quietly from one generation to the next whenever people chose silence instead of honesty. I walked toward Elena slowly. Then, before I could overthink it, I wrapped my arms around her. For 1 second she froze in shock. Then she held on to me like someone who had waited her whole life to stop standing outside the family door. Behind us, David quietly started crying too. And honestly, so did I. 3 months later, we scattered Frank's ashes beside the Oregon lake. Just the three of us. No lawyers. No reporters. No speeches. Only wind moving across the water while snow melted quietly along the shoreline. David visits me every Sunday now. Not out of guilt anymore. Because he wants to. Victoria and David separated peacefully a month after Christmas. No screaming. No scandal. Just two people finally admitting fear had replaced trust somewhere along the way. And Elena? She still lives near the lake house while finishing graduate school. Sometimes she calls me just to ask about Frank's favorite recipes. Sometimes we sit on the porch together watching rain move across the water while sharing stories about the same man we loved in different ways. Life doesn't always give families clean endings. Sometimes all you get is the chance to finally see each other honestly before it's too late. And maybe that's enough. Because in the end, the $20 million inheritance mattered far less than the simple truth Frank spent years trying to leave behind. People can survive betrayal. But loneliness? Loneliness is what truly breaks a family apart.